Now, if you've been following me for a while, please do not be shocked when you see me. I got a new beard trimmer and I put it on the lowest setting, which is how my old beard trimmer worked, and it worked fine. This obviously was a little too short. Now, when I first started playing Dungeons & Dragons and became a Dungeon Master earlier last year, one of the most confusing aspects of the game for me was the whole idea of how surprise works mechanically when it comes to combat and rolling initiative. Did it make sense narratively? Sure, it absolutely did. Was the mechanic still very confusing? Absolutely. But not only that, it was just so meticulous and clunky and just so time consuming to get it all figured out just so you could start the first round of combat when surprise happens. And in most cases, the way that surprise works is that a party is trying to sneak up on another party in most cases. Now, if you're not familiar with how surprise works in the 2014 rules of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, this is generally how it shakes out to be. Anyone who is attempting to sneak makes a stealth check. The surpriser's stealth rolls are compared to the passive perception score of the people they're attempting to surprise. Any creature whose passive perception is below the stealth roll of the ambushing creature has the surprise condition. Otherwise, they don't get the surprise benefit on that creature. Everyone rolls initiative. The DM creates the initiative order list based on their rolls. In the first round of combat, you go through initiative order as normal with the following differences. Those who are surprised cannot move or take an action on their first turn of combat, so their turn ends as soon as it starts. But those who are surprised can take a reaction after their turn ends. Now, this is a part that often gets overlooked or confused with the end of the round instead of the turn. Then combat resumes as usual when the second round begins. Now, if you followed all of that and you're still with me here, either you've done this many times before or you have a really high Constitution score. And if you have done this before, please leave a comment to let us know what other ways you've seen, surprise work in your 2014 5th edition games, because I'm really curious to see how this has played out in other people's tables. Needless to say, this is clearly trying to create a sense of immersion of what actually happens when a party surprises another party in combat, but it clearly was a little bit confusing and just kind of got in the way of getting combat started. So when the 2024 edition came out for the Player's Handbook from Dungeons & Dragons, I was really happy to see that they decided to change how surprise works when rolling initiative. Generally speaking, for the 2024 rules, the DM still decides if a party is surprised or not. And so they're kind of a little bit more loose on how that works because they understand that situations and contexts are different and that it probably shouldn't be as rigid. But generally speaking, the suggestion that they have made is that if a party is sneaking on another party, then they all still roll a stealth check. And now it is a DC 15 instead of comparing it to a passive perception of that creature. So it reduces the amount of comparison and looking up things in order to decide if a creature is surprised or not. So it does make it easier, but I know there are some people that have concerns that thinks that having a set number is also problematic. And the nice thing is with the new rules and the language that they put in there, DMs can still change it if they want to without a problem. So if you feel like that situation requires a higher or a lower DC because of a creature's passive perception, they can still do that. And the new Dungeon Master Guide also includes something called the group ability checks, where if the whole group rolls stealth and at least half of them succeed on that 15 or higher, then the whole party succeeds, which kind of speeds things up a little bit. Now, that's not a new rule. That was technically in the 2014 rules in the Player's Handbook, but the new DMG does include that as an option here as well. And there's also other ways where the DM can decide that somebody gets advantage on initiative roll depending on the circumstance. So, for example, let's say there is a kobold artificer that is talking to a creature and they think that creature is a doppelganger and is really a enemy of them, and they decide to cast Firebolt at that creature. Well, everybody rolls an initiative. The person who gets cast Firebolt at doesn't necessarily roll with disadvantage, but because the Kobold Artificer did something surprising, the DM can decide to give that character advantage on their initiative roll. So needless to say, I absolutely love this change. It's just more straightforward. It's easier to determine who's surprised. It gives DMs more flexibility depending on their circumstance, and it gets the party into combat more quickly. But then I read what the consequence was if somebody did get surprised. It says if a combatant is surprised by combat starting, that combatant has disadvantage on their initiative roll. And when I first read this, I just felt very underwhelmed. It was Something that I think I was just kind of disappointed in, because disadvantage on an initiative roll doesn't necessarily reflect what happens to a party when they get surprised, right? Because the argument can be made that somebody who rolls initiative with disadvantage can still roll high on both of those dice and get in the higher initiative order than somebody who has a straight D20 roll and rolls very poorly. And so it doesn't accurately reflect what happens in that surprise. And it doesn't give a sense of consequence to that, because initiative order just tells you, what order people are going during the turn or during the round. And so it kind of removes that feeling of what happens to that party when you get the jump on them. And so it could really be something where you have a good chance, or you come up with a great plan to surprise an enemy, and it still might not feel like it worked very well, because if the dice aren't in your favor, then it doesn't really reflect the surprise that you tried to get on that enemy. So I started to think about, what could I do in my games to make surprise have a more consequential feel to it? My first thought was, well, if they have disadvantage on initiative roll if they're surprised, then maybe the people who did the surprising should get advantage on their initiative rolls. I know it's not exactly immersive in that consequential feeling, but at least it's kind of a step in the right directions. Then I remembered that those pesky classes like Barbarians and Rogues Assassin actually gets advantage on initiative at certain levels. And the new rules for hiding actually says that if you're hiding successfully, you get the invisible condition, which specifically states that you get advantage on your initiative rolls. So then I thought about, well, maybe for those characters that already have advantage on initiative rolls, they can add their proficiency bonus to the roll. So that way they have advantage, and then they can add +2, +3, +4 to whatever they roll for initiative, right? Brilliant idea. Except then I remembered that the alert feat actually has that in its description. So a player may feel cheated out of that benefit if they take that feat. So that's when I said, okay, so let's assume that at initiative roll, the players already have advantage on their initiative. They already add their proficiency bonus to that initiative roll. Then maybe what we can do is in the first round of combat that they get advantage on their attack rolls. And I thought, that's a great idea too. But then I remember there are classes that already have advantage on some of their attacks, like Barbarians with Reckless Attack. With Rogue, some of their features have that. The new Sorcerer class actually has a feature where they can get advantage on attacks. And then there's that new Weapon Master property called Vex, where if someone successfully hits a creature with a weapon with that property, then they get advantage on their next attack roll. So then I thought, what about, and it was at this point I realized that I was basically reconstructing what made the 2014 rules of surprise so frustrating. So looking back at it, I've actually grown to love the new surprise rules for initiative. Sure, it's not as consequential as it felt like with 2014 rules, but it gets you into the combat and the situation quicker than trying to figure out and spend 20 minutes going through the initiative order and making sure that all the mechanics were done correctly by the time you get to the end of the first round. And that's what I've been loving about some of these new changes in the Dungeons & Dragons 2024 edition. It's making the changes so that it's more accessible to more players. It's straightforward with trying to figure out what to do in certain circumstances. And it's getting people immediately into the fun, which is what they're trying to achieve and accomplish in a lot of these changes that they made. So even though I didn't love the new changes to the surprise rule, the more I kind of worked through it and the more I thought about it, I realized that this is a better way of just doing it so that we can get into the fun of playing a tabletop role-playing game. So that was supposed to be the end of the video, but then later on that night, I got on the Dungeons & Dragons official Discord server, and someone posted a situation that they just ran that kind of pokes a problem with the new surprise rules that I think merits having a conversation about. Here's the scenario that was posted in the Discord server. An NPC archer is hundreds of feet from the target. The target does not detect the archer and fails its roll. Can the archer attack before initiative happens? Now, this is probably going to be the most common scenario that we run into when it comes to surprise attacks, because as the new rules state, what happens is instead of getting that attack off before initiative rolls, you actually call for initiative with the surpriser getting advantage and then the surprisee getting disadvantage. But they brought up the good point that even with disadvantage, if the surprisee gets high enough on both of those rolls, then technically speaking, that person could still interrupt or stop the player or the NPC archer from getting the attack off, which means that even though they had all those things, the surprise attack didn't really happen. And that just seems kind of problematic. But for this person, that what they did was they actually had the attack happen before they rolled initiative. And some of the players had called out and said that this is actually not what's according to the rules. So we had a whole conversation about this and kind of figure out how do we resolve this, because there's merits to both sides, right? So these are the proposals that I would give as options that you might want to have as a house rule for running this sort of situation. Proposal number one, adopt the Baldur's Gate 3 method on how they handle the situation. So what you do is if the player or the NPC wants to try to get an attack off before initiative is rolled, then you allow them to do that, have them roll for stealth, and if they succeed on that, have them roll for attack. Whether they hit or miss, you resolve that situation and then you roll initiative. And then the person who initiated combat with that sneak attack doesn't get a full action on their turn in the initiative order. So the players who were surprised still get disadvantage. The players who succeeded with their stealth check still get advantage in initiative roll. But whoever tried to get that sneak attack in miss out on their action, but they still have their movement and they still have their bonus action. So that way you kind of be able to merge both worlds. I think it's not a perfect solution, but it does kind of reflect what would probably happen in an actual situation like that and allow somebody to feel like they were still able to get a sneak attack in before initiative gets rolled, and you run the chance or risk of having that attack get disrupted even though they succeeded on their stealth check and their attack roll on all those things. My second suggestion is to use a feature in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide called initiative scores. Now, initiative scores kind of work like passive initiative, where you give every character, both player and NPC, a baseline initiative score instead of having them roll for it. So you have everybody start off with a 10 for their initiative score, and then you would add different bonuses depending on what kind of buffs and debuffs or bonuses or situations that affects their initiative roll. So, for example, if they have advantage on initiative for that scenario, or because they have a feature that allows them to have an advantage on initiative rolls, you give them a +5. You add their dexterity modifier to that score as well too. If they have disadvantage on that initiative roll, whether because of the situation or some other reason, then you take -5 to that score. So you would create a list of passive initiative scores and kind of put them in order of that situation to predetermine what the initiative order is going to be. So doing initiative scores in this way helps guarantees that the character who did the surprise attack goes first, or at least towards the beginning of the initiative order, because you're using scores based on the situation and the character's traits rather than the luck of the roll of the dice. But let's say you get a weird situation where even all that is said and done, the person who was surprised still is higher in the initiative order than the person who surprised them with the attack goes first or goes before that character, right? So what you could do as a DM is you look at that list and you pretty much naturally let the scene or the spotlight goes from each character in that scene in the initiative order until it gets to the character that is starting the initiative by doing the surprise attack. So let's say you got player A and player B that is listed higher in the initiative order than character C, who did the surprise attack. Well, then with player A, you just say, hey, so what is your character doing in this moment? You're not calling to their attention that initiative is about to happen. This sounds very natural in the game that you're just asking what the characters are doing as things are happening. And so you do that, let them say, what their character is doing, and then you go to the next person in turn, ask them what their character is doing, and resolve any of that. And then once it gets to the character that initiates the initiative roll with the surprise attack, then you go into initiative and tell them that we're using initiative score order to do this encounter. So this method does rely you to kind of be more comfortable and flexible with improvisation, because you have to be able to look at the list and make it feel like it's a natural part of the conversation and not tip off your players that initiative is kind of happening here. But this is a good way to kind of bridge a gap with rules that are listed in the Dungeon Master's Guide that still makes it seem like, or makes it feel like, the surprise attack has that consequence, and that it happens the way it should happen and not getting like so metagamey with, rolling for advantage and disadvantage. And the characters who are surprised somehow knows that now there's an attack happening when they really shouldn't have. The last suggestion I have is not only to have the surprise advantage and disadvantage rules for the players involved, but also use that unseen target rule where those who are not seen has advantage on their attacks and those who are trying to attack the people that are unseen have disadvantage. Now, it doesn't resolve the issue with the fact that the person who did the surprise attack could still show up lower in the initiative order depending on the dice rolls, but at least it balanced out the attacks a little bit so that way the person who did do the surprise attack has a better chance of landing their attack, and then those who were surprised are not going to have as likely of a chance to get an attack in before getting the consequence of that surprise attack. Now, again, it does get a little bit weirdly metagamey because when you roll that initiative, they're not supposed to know that there was somebody that was hitting when that attack happened, so they could still attack them, and you have to have that whole conversation. So it's not a perfect solution. None of these are really perfect solutions, but I think these are at least options that you can have discussions with your table about to figure out how you might want to resolve a situation like this. And I think that's one of the things that these new changes in the 2024 rule books have really pushed for in this scenario is that it's trying to give the DMs and tables more power to be able to decide how they want to handle these situations. So even though the 2024 rules on surprise initiative is a little bit more vague when it comes to situations like this, they do empower you to figure out how you might want to solve that as a group at your table, because every table is going to be different for a number of reasons. In the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide, they actually have a section talking about a house rules document that you share with your table so that when you come to a scenario where you have to interpret the rules in some way, once your table agrees this is how you would resolve that situation, you write that down, and now that becomes the rules that you play by at your table. And I think this is a good solution to do that. So no matter what you end up doing, as long as you talk to your table about how to handle that situation and everybody agrees upon that interpretation, then you just move on as normal and everybody is happy. Even though it might look different from table to table, you're still having fun at your game. But I'm kind of curious if you know of a situation where this has happened and that other tables resolve this differently. Definitely let me know. If you know there's other kinds of circumstances or situations where the new rules kind of make it a little bit more complicated and not streamlining it, I would love to hear those things, because I want to know, just like I'm sure many of you want to know, what are some scenarios that could be something that we need to think about and discuss ahead of time before we get to that situation, so that way we have a plan in place. I'm curious to see how this turns out and how well this plays out using some of these suggestions that we came up with. So let me know what you think, and I'm looking forward to having that conversation with y'all.